Tonight, a quiet shock is moving through the corridors of Washington and the boardrooms of American industry because something almost unthinkable just happened. The United States, the largest economy the world has ever known, has reportedly approached Canada with a staggering request: a $573 billion rescue tied to the freight rail system that keeps North American industry alive. Not an offer, not a joint investment proposal, but a request. For years, Washington pushed tariffs, trade pressure, and economic leverage against one of its closest partners. Yet now the reality of the continent's infrastructure is impossible to ignore. Because the backbone of the North American rail network, the arteries that carry grain from the Midwest, auto parts to Detroit, crude oil to refineries, lumber to construction markets, and consumer goods to distribution centers, is deeply tied to Canada. The locomotives, the dispatching systems, the scheduling networks, even the strategic corridors that determine how cargo flows across the continent are largely managed by companies headquartered in Montreal and Calgary. Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City, two of the 7 giant Class I rail systems in North America, operate thousands of miles of track inside the United States itself, moving American cargo between American cities. But over the past year, something subtle began to change. As Canada diversified trade toward Europe and Asia, freight patterns shifted with it. Trains that once thundered south toward Chicago, Detroit, and Memphis increasingly turned east to Halifax and Montreal, or west to Vancouver and Prince Rupert, seaports that connect directly to global shipping lanes. And suddenly, the ripple effects began to spread. Factories waiting for parts, grain elevators filling faster than trains can arrive, refineries watching crude shipments slow, retail supply chains tightening. Analysts now estimate the cascading economic disruption, idle production lines, delayed exports, backed-up freight yards, could reach an astonishing $573 billion over the next 3 years. And Ottawa's response has been blunt. Instead of restoring the old north-south flow, Canada has announced a massive $30 billion expansion of an east-west freight corridor designed to strengthen its own global export routes. Every kilometer of new rail laid toward Atlantic and Pacific ports means less capacity returning toward the U.S. border. In other words, the infrastructure that once served American demand is being permanently redirected toward world markets. Even legendary investor Warren Buffett, whose Berkshire Hathaway owns the massive BNSF railway network and who has spent decades studying the economics of rail transport, warned that this moment was almost inevitable. In quiet but unmistakable terms, he described it as one of the most predictable infrastructure shocks in modern American history, the natural consequence of pushing economic pressure on a partner that controls critical logistics arteries. Because railways are not simply steel tracks and locomotives, they are strategic lifelines. And asking the country that operates a large portion of that system to step in with a bailout after years of trade friction sends a signal that resonates far beyond transportation. It reveals leverage, dependency, and the delicate balance of power inside North America's economic engine. Yet the sentence now echoing through diplomatic circles came from Canada's leadership when asked whether Washington's stabilization proposal would even be considered. 9 words, delivered with calm finality, words that carried the weight of infrastructure, trade flows, and political reality. A reminder that alliances can stretch, markets can shift, and in geopolitics, just as in rail logistics, you cannot dismantle the tracks and still expect the trains to arrive on time. When you begin to understand how the North American rail system actually functions, who controls it, how it was designed, where and how deeply integrated it has become over more than a century, the story unfolding right now suddenly looks far bigger than a simple transportation problem. Because what Washington is confronting is not just a disruption in logistics, but a structural shock inside the very arteries of the American economy. The trade confrontation that escalated between the United States and Canada didn't just affect tariffs or export statistics, it quietly rippled through the infrastructure that moves everything Americans rely on every day. Analysts now estimate the economic consequences could reach as high as $573 billion as supply chains slow, production lines pause, and freight bottlenecks spread across sectors that normally never appear on the same page of an economic report. And when the request for assistance reportedly moved from Washington toward Ottawa, it revealed something many policymakers had never fully calculated: that the continent's freight network does not operate as 3 isolated national systems separated by borders. It operates as one vast continental machine. For more than 150 years, the rail corridors of North America were engineered to move goods across thousands of miles, with almost invisible transitions between countries. The US-Canada border in this system was never designed as a wall. It functioned more like a seam stitched into a single piece of economic fabric. In everyday operation, trains cross it constantly, quietly carrying agricultural shipments, manufacturing components, energy products, and consumer goods that keep industries running on both sides of the line. That integration became so normal that most people stopped thinking about it entirely. Even many officials shaping trade policy appeared to overlook it. And perhaps the most surprising detail for many Americans is ownership. Canadian National Railway, headquartered in Montreal, operates a vast network stretching from Canada's Atlantic coast all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Its tracks run through key American industrial states: Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, carrying enormous volumes of cargo inside the United States itself. Not just Canadian exports, but American grain traveling south toward Gulf ports, chemical shipments linking southern refineries to northeastern manufacturing hubs, and automotive components moving between factories across the Midwest. Alongside it stands Canadian Pacific Kansas City, headquartered in Calgary, the result of a historic merger that created the first single-line rail network linking Canada, the United States, and Mexico into one continuous freight corridor. Its trains run through the American Midwest and Southern Plains, along the Gulf Coast, and deep into Mexico, hauling everything from agricultural harvests and petroleum products to the intermodal containers that feed retail supply chains. When these networks adjust direction, when freight patterns shift east toward Atlantic ports or west toward Pacific gateways, the consequences ripple instantly through factories, farms, and distribution centers across the continent. That is why economists now say this moment is not simply about trains running late. It is about what happens when the most powerful economy on Earth suddenly discovers that the system moving its goods was never entirely its own. And as this crisis unfolds, the pressure will not stay confined to rail yards or trade ministries. It will surface in grocery prices, factory output, and farm incomes across key American states. Because every potential solution, every rerouted shipment, every restored corridor, every negotiation over capacity, now runs through one unavoidable junction: Ottawa. These railways are not minor players supporting an American-led network. They are among the giants of the entire continent. Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City are two of the 7 Class I railroads in North America, a category reserved for the largest and most powerful freight carriers moving cargo across thousands of miles of track. Together, they command a massive share of the cross-border freight traffic that keeps North America's economy running. They own the rail lines, the locomotives, the freight cars, the dispatching systems. They hire the crews, manage the routes, determine how much capacity goes where, and they make those decisions in corporate headquarters in Montreal and Calgary, under Canadian management and Canadian commercial priorities. And what these railways move across the continent reads almost like a blueprint of the American economy itself. Grain harvested in Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and the Dakotas heading toward export terminals and food processors. Crude oil flowing from Canadian fields down to refineries across the Midwest and Gulf Coast. Automotive components shuttling between assembly plants tied together in a fragile cross-border supply chain. Chemicals, fertilizer, lumber, steel, potash, finished machinery, consumer goods, and endless rows of intermodal containers carrying electronics, clothing, and retail products from Pacific ports deep into inland distribution hubs. Modern freight logistics operates with almost surgical precision. Railcars are scheduled to arrive within tight windows measured in hours, not days. Inventory systems and production schedules are built around the assumption that trains will arrive exactly when expected. There is no massive warehouse filled with spare auto parts waiting to rescue a stalled factory line. There is no extra storage facility ready to hold a harvest if grain trains stop running. The system functions only because it has been historically reliable, and that reliability existed because the cross-border economic relationship worked smoothly. When that relationship began to fracture, the reliability fractured with it, and according to analysts, very few officials in Washington had fully modeled what the next stage of that breakdown would look like. What followed did not arrive as a single dramatic shutdown. Instead, it emerged the way many large economic crises unfold, through a chain reaction of second-order effects that quietly compound until the system begins to strain. as Canada gradually redirected trade flows away from the United States and toward other global partners, Europe, the United Kingdom, Asian markets, and the broader Indo-Pacific. The pattern of rail demand began to shift. Fewer Canadian exports traveling south meant fewer trains moving along the traditional north-south corridors that once dominated continental freight traffic. At the same time, demand surged along east-west routes as Canadian producers focused on shipping goods to coastal ports for global export. Halifax and Montreal, on the Atlantic side, began handling growing volumes, while Vancouver and Prince Rupert on the Pacific expanded rapidly as gateways to Asian markets. Rail traffic toward these ports climbed steadily, and companies like CN and CPKC responded exactly as commercial enterprises always do. They followed the demand. More trains moving east and west, fewer heading south across the border. The shift was not directed by government orders or political strategy. It was the result of market signals. Freight capacity flows where trade flows, and trade itself had been reshaped by tariffs, restrictions, and countermeasures that altered where goods were sold and where they needed to travel. The cumulative effect spread quickly. Canadian responses in energy policy, mineral exports, agricultural routing, and automotive supply rules all contributed to a steady reduction in the volume of cargo crossing the U.S.-Canada border by rail. What looked at first like isolated trade adjustments gradually added up to a structural change in the continent's logistics network, a shift that now echoes across farms, factories, and freight yards on both sides of the border. Less cross-border trade meant fewer trains crossing the border. Fewer trains meant shrinking rail capacity. And shrinking capacity meant longer delays, unpredictable scheduling, and a freight system that slowly began to fail American shippers. No government ever announced a rail blockade. No dramatic embargo was declared. Instead, the economic incentives that once made north-south rail traffic smooth and dependable were quietly dismantled by the trade conflict itself. Canadian rail companies began shifting priority toward domestic shipments and export traffic heading to global markets, a logical commercial decision based on where growth and revenue were now concentrated. American cargo was not officially blocked from the network. It was simply moved down the priority list. Shipments that once moved quickly now departed later, arrived slower, and lost the reliability that modern logistics absolutely depends on. And in a supply chain designed around precise timing, slower and less predictable transport doesn't just create delays, it fractures the entire system downstream. Factories begin waiting, distribution centers stall, retailers struggle to restock, and consumers eventually feel the consequences. The economic impact arrived like a slow, rolling avalanche. At first, almost invisible, then suddenly impossible to ignore. Across the American Midwest, grain elevators began filling beyond normal limits. Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Nebraska, and the Dakotas saw harvests arrive with nowhere left to move them because the rail cars that usually carried millions of tons toward export terminals and processing plants were arriving far less frequently. Grain that normally sits in storage for days remained there for weeks, and when grain waits too long, it deteriorates. Temperature swings, humidity, and pests slowly reduce quality. Once premium-grade crops begin losing certification and value, turning what should have been a profitable harvest into a financial disaster for farmers. Millions of tons of American grain suddenly face the risk of spoilage, not because of drought or disease or storms, but because the rail cars meant to transport it were now running toward coastal ports instead of south across the border. Livestock operations that rely on rail-delivered feed reported shortages. Feedlots across Kansas and Texas were forced to buy grain transported by truck at dramatically higher prices because rail delivery had become unreliable. At the same time, the narrow export windows that allow American grain to compete against crops from Brazil, Argentina, Australia, and Canada began slipping away as shipments failed to reach global markets on time. The auto industry felt the shock next. Canadian restrictions on parts had already strained production lines. Now the rail network responsible for delivering the components that did clear trade barriers was itself slowing down. Parts sat in rail yards waiting for available capacity. Components that should have arrived within hours sometimes took weeks. Assembly plants already operating below normal levels due to supply shortages now faced a second crisis: logistics failure on the parts that were actually available. The two disruptions didn't simply add together. They multiplied the damage. Energy shipments also slowed. Rail deliveries of crude oil, natural gas liquids, stair, and propane heating fuel across the Midwest and northern states began falling behind schedule. Some refineries operated below capacity because crude shipments arrived late. Rural communities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, many of which rely on rail-delivered propane, suddenly faced concerns about supply shortages heading into the winter months. Chemical manufacturers reported raw material delays stretching 2 to 4 weeks. Retail distribution centers across northern states began noticing gaps on inventory lists as container traffic slowed along the rail corridors. Prices started rising as logistics costs climbed. Trucking, the only major alternative to rail transport, costs several times more per ton-mile and simply does not have the capacity to absorb the overflow from rail disruption. Industry groups warned that the freight system was approaching a breaking point. Some analysts described it as the most severe transportation disruption the United States had experienced since the Second World War. When economists finally added up the consequences, delayed shipments, stalled production, spoiled agricultural exports, emergency trucking costs, factory downtime, and the chain reaction spreading through supply networks, the estimated damage reached an extraordinary figure, roughly $573 billion over the next 3 years. When economists began breaking down the damage, the scale of the crisis became impossible to ignore because the losses were not concentrated in one industry or one region, they were spread across the entire American economy. Agricultural losses alone were estimated to exceed $85 billion as delayed shipments and deteriorating grain cut deeply into farm income. Manufacturing disruptions climbed past $140 billion as factories slowed or halted production while waiting for parts that once arrived on precise rail schedules. Energy supply chain costs surged beyond $55 billion as refineries and fuel distributors struggled with delayed crude and propane shipments. Direct freight delays themselves accounted for more than $120 billion, and the rest came from the cascading consequences: higher consumer prices, missed export opportunities, rising logistics costs, and lost competitiveness in global markets. When every dollar of that damage could be traced through a chain of cause and effect, a trade confrontation that disrupted trade flows, which disrupted rail traffic, which disrupted the movement of everything those trains normally carry, which is to say, nearly everything. And then something unprecedented happened. The United States government approached Canada asking for cooperation to stabilize the rail network. The proposal was presented as a continental logistics framework, a joint infrastructure initiative designed to restore reliable cross-border freight service, guarantee American shippers improved access to Canadian rail corridors, and share the cost of strengthening the system between the two governments. Diplomatic language described it as coordination, partnership, and shared infrastructure responsibility. But behind those carefully chosen words was a stark reality. The United States was asking Canada to restore the reliability of a rail network that Canada had no obligation to prioritize, especially during a trade conflict Washington itself had initiated. Remove the diplomatic phrasing, and the situation looked very different. A country that had spent years applying tariffs, trade restrictions, and economic pressure on its closest neighbor was now asking that same neighbor to help keep its supply chains functioning. The contradiction was hard to miss. For months, the political rhetoric had portrayed Canada as economically dependent. Yet suddenly, Washington needed cooperation from Ottawa to keep freight moving smoothly. Even the public messaging revealed the disconnect. Officials described the request as asking Canada to behave as a responsible partner in continental infrastructure. Yet Canada had spent more than a year responding to economic pressure measures coming from the United States. According to several reports, one moment inside a White House briefing captured the underlying surprise of the situation. During a presentation explaining the rail disruptions, the president reportedly asked a simple question: why do Canadian companies control so much of the rail infrastructure that carries American freight? Advisors explained that Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City are private corporations that expanded into the United States over decades through acquisitions approved by American regulators and facilitated through open market transactions. In other words, the ownership structure had been built legally, gradually, and with full approval from U.S. authorities over many years. The answer reportedly produced a silence that lingered longer than the explanation itself. The reality was clear. Companies headquartered in Canada now operated large portions of the rail networks that move goods across the United States. And that ownership existed because the United States had allowed and approved it. The situation exposed a simple but powerful truth. The country Washington had chosen to pressure economically was also deeply embedded in the infrastructure that moves American freight. But Canada's response to the proposed stabilization plan was not what many officials expected. It was not a negotiation. It was not a hesitant refusal softened by diplomatic language. Instead, Ottawa presented a clear decision. Canada declined participation in the proposed rail stabilization framework. The response arrived through a formal diplomatic message and a simultaneous public statement, leaving little room for reinterpretation. Canadian officials explained that their government had no obligation to subsidize freight capacity that primarily served industries in a country that had imposed tariffs and trade restrictions on Canadian producers. Cross-border rail service, they emphasized, is a commercial activity run by private companies responding to market demand, not a political tool to offset another country's trade policies. And then Canada revealed the direction it had chosen instead: a $30 billion expansion of an east-west rail corridor, the largest rail infrastructure investment in Canadian history. The project focuses on expanding capacity toward Vancouver and Prince Rupert on the Pacific coast, strengthening Canada's direct connection to Asian markets. It also includes expanded links to Halifax and Montreal on the Atlantic side, creating faster access to European trade routes. New intermodal terminals will connect inland manufacturing and resource regions to both coastlines, while additional track capacity and double-tracking upgrades strengthen Canada's transcontinental rail lines. The strategy links everything together through an integrated logistics system connecting mines, factories, rail corridors, and shipping ports. In this emerging network, Canadian freight moves directly from production to global markets without needing to pass through the United States, where every dollar invested in east-west rail infrastructure increases Canada's export capacity toward the world while reducing reliance on traditional north-south trade flows. In practical terms, that means the rail capacity once dedicated to cross-border shipments may not return. The new corridors generate their own demand, attract new customers, and create a self-sustaining logistics system. An infrastructure that sustains itself economically rarely disappears simply because political relationships change. Canadian rail companies publicly supported the expansion, emphasizing that capacity decisions are determined by commercial demand rather than political instruction. And right now, they noted, demand is growing along the east-west routes, linking Canada to global markets, while traffic along the north-south corridors toward the United States continues to decline. In freight transportation, the rule is simple: where the demand goes, the trains follow. From a strategic perspective, the situation unfolding between the United States and Canada is not simply a logistics dispute, but a structural shift in North American economic power. For decades, the continental supply chain operated on the assumption that political stability between the two countries was permanent and that infrastructure integration would always work in Washington's favor. What the current crisis reveals is the opposite. Infrastructure ownership and trade flows ultimately follow economic incentives, not political expectations. By redirecting rail capacity toward global export corridors, Canada is signaling a long-term strategy of reducing dependency on the U.S. market while strengthening its position as a global logistics hub connecting Asia, Europe, and the Arctic routes. In the short term, the United States is likely to experience continued disruptions in agriculture, manufacturing, and energy logistics, particularly in Midwestern states where rail freight is critical. Over the next 2 to 3 years, Washington will probably attempt a combination of domestic rail investment, regulatory pressure, and diplomatic negotiations to restore some level of north-south capacity. However, once infrastructure and trade patterns shift, they rarely return to their previous structure. The most realistic forecast is a gradual rebalancing of North American logistics, Canada expanding east-west global corridors, while the United States accelerates efforts to rebuild internal freight resilience. In geopolitical terms, this episode may become a defining lesson for U.S. policymakers about the strategic importance of supply chains, infrastructure ownership, and the unintended consequences of economic coercion in an interconnected continental system.